Welcome to the New Life Ministries podcast. Have you ever just been incandescent with fury? Your body gets hot and your scalp gets tight and the blood in your ears is pounding so loud you cannot hear. You are just so angry. How dare they? Well, you're not alone. In fact, it is that very rage that was felt thousands of years ago by King Nebuchadnezzar when faced with three young men who refused to worship his God and play by his rules. Let's join Curtis as we read Daniel 3.
Hey, good morning. Those of you joining us online, welcome. I'm glad you're here. Today we're going to look at Daniel chapter 3. And if your Bible looks like this one, it's on page 1326. 1326. 1326. I was concerned how a red shirt would stand up with orange pumpkins, but I think we're okay. So let's talk about fire. Fire can be a friend and fire can be an enemy, right? Fire is helpful to produce heat, to cook, or to warm things up. Helpful to a point. And then after that point, fire causes pain and damage. When I go camping, I cook over a BioLite, a little camp stove that runs on twigs and branches. It's a great little stove. It can bring water to a boil in under 5 minutes, but it's a very hot flame, and I can't turn it down. So if I go to try to make Jiffy Pop popcorn over this fire, it burns the whole thing, which I've tried several times. My buddy's been experimenting with making an oven with a campfire, making a campfire oven, and he's got this insulated cover that he puts over his stove, and on a cold night, it's fantastic. Well, there was one night we were camping, and I'm sure it was snowing out, but we're getting close to it. And he pulled out these little personal pizzas that he was able to bake in the oven. And when you're in the wilds of the backcountry and someone serves you fresh pizza, man, that tastes good. It is the best pizza ever. But if that oven cover slips a little bit, the heat that comes out from his fire, it will burn you. It's hot. So fire is a friend or it's an enemy. We enjoy having a campfire this time of year, right? You're outside in autumn, roasting hot dogs and making s'mores, and it's lovely. But that fire, if it gets too big, becomes a raging fire, and it gets out of control, and fires destroy. And certainly in Canada this year, we saw a lot of fires that were just raging out of control. Instead of a raging fire, what about a fiery rage? What does that mean? That means that someone's anger is out of control and it's causing damage, right? So in Daniel chapter 3, we have God versus a fiery rage with a raging fire. Like what I did there? The fiery rage, the raging fire? So if we back up in Daniel chapter 2, which we looked at last week, King Nebuchadnezzar over Babylon had a dream, remember? And in this dream, he saw this huge statue, and there were layers of material. There was a head of gold, a body of silver, there were silver body, bronze belly, legs of iron, and feet of iron and clay. And last week, we read that Daniel interpreted the dream and said to Nebuchadnezzar that he was the head of gold, and that all the nations after him were the other layers. But in the end, God would set up a kingdom and destroy the whole thing. And Nebuchadnezzar seemed really pleased that his kingdom was secure. But I asked you last week, do you think he understood the part about where God wins, that God defeats him? You know, Nebuchadnezzar had said to Daniel at the end, truly your God is the greatest of gods. Your God is the Lord over kings, the revealer of mysteries. So he was thankful. But did he understand what God was saying about what happens in the end? So that's our setup going into Daniel 3. Let me just offer a prayer as we begin. Father, help us to honor you in this text, that we would hear what your Spirit wants to say to us, and we would hear how you want us to respond to this text, that we would know what you would have us do with this story. So may we honor you today. Amen. Okay, Daniel chapter 3. This will be fun. King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue 90 feet high and 9 feet wide, and he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then he sent messengers to all the high priests, officials, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the provincial officials to come to the dedication of the statue he had set up. So all these officials came and stood before the statue King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald shouted out, "People of all races and nations and languages, listen to the king's command. When you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, pipes, and other musical instruments, bow to the ground to worship King Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue. Anyone who refuses to obey will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." So at the sound of the musical instruments, all the people, whatever their race or nation or language, bowed to the ground and worshiped the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. But some of the astrologers went to the king and informed on the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "Long live the king! You issued a decree requiring all the people to bow down and worship the gold statue when they hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipes, and the other instruments. That decree also states that those who refuse to obey must be thrown into the blazing furnace. But there are some Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, whom you have put in charge of the province of Babylon. They pay no attention to you, your majesty. They refuse to serve your gods and do not worship the gold statue you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage and ordered that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. When they were brought in, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or worship the gold statue that I have set up? I will give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue that I have made when you hear the sound of the musical instruments. But if you refuse, you'll be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. And then what God will be able to save you from my power?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, our God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, O Majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your Majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up." Nebuchadnezzar was so furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face became distorted with rage. He commanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual. Then he ordered some of the strongest men in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So they tied them up and threw them into the furnace, fully dressed in their pants, turbans, robes, and other garments. And because the king, in his anger, had demanded such a hot fire in the furnace, the flames killed the soldiers as they threw the 3 men in. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell into the roaring flames. But suddenly, Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, "Didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace?" "Yes, your majesty, we certainly did." "Look," Nebuchadnezzar shouted, "I see 4 men, unbound, walking around in the fire, unharmed. And the 4th looks like a god." Then Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. Then the high officers, officials, governors, and advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their heads was singed, and their clothing was not scorched. They didn't even smell of smoke. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted in him. They defied the king's command and were willing to die rather than to serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make this decree. If any people, whatever their race or nation or language, speak a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, They will be torn limb from limb, and their houses will be turned into heaps of rubble. There is no other God who can rescue like this." The king then promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to even higher positions in the province of Babylon. Quite the story, eh? This Nebuchadnezzar guy loves to kill people. Or try. Yeah, man. It's a fun story. So let's review. He has set up a statue, and it's not necessarily of Nebuchadnezzar himself. I always sort of assumed it was him. Not necessarily. It might be of his god. It could have been something very tall that was on a pedestal with words on the pedestal. Whatever it is, it's huge. It's 90 feet. That's a 9-story building. So our buildings here are 5 stories.
With feet made of clay.
Well, no, this one is just straight up, actually. Because if you think about 90 feet and 9 feet wide, it's all out of whack, yeah. And it's solid gold. So, and it's also set up on the plain of Dura. So sometimes people would set up statues to declare who had power in the land, or who was the god over this land, who's in charge, who should be honored as you enter, who reigns here. So that's our setup. But in the previous chapter, we read that he had this dream about a statue, and that statue got destroyed in the dream. So you got to wonder, is Nebuchadnezzar building something in response to the dream? Like, is he in defiance of that dream? Or is he just celebrating his own greatness? Because in the other dream, he was just the head of gold. And now he's made something that is solid gold. It's hard to say what's going on in his head. What's clear is that his statue and his ego are deeply tied together. If you don't worship the statue, he takes that as a direct insult against him and his authority and power as king. So we like this story because God is so faithful, right? God rescues. So we're going to look at it from the perspective of the 3 guys, but then we're going to look at it from the perspective of the king, okay? So the 3 guys don't worship the statue. They don't obey the decree. Why? Because it would be easier if they did. Can you imagine the anxiety of knowing you might be killed if you don't do this one thing? You know, like if it was you, honestly, what would you do? Like, I'll just bow down and not mean it. Like that would get me out of there. The reason they don't do it is because of the first 2 commandments in the 10 commandments. The first commandment is God saying, "You will have no other God besides me." And the second commandment is, "You will not make an idol of any kind or an image, and you are not going to bow down to it or worship it." So Nebuchadnezzar is giving them a demand that would cause them to break the first 2 commandments of worshiping the Lord their God. So that's why this is so important. And I think Nebuchadnezzar is actually not challenging their commitment to their God. I think he's just really focused on himself and his power. Because it often works that way. Like, I don't really care who you worship, just pay attention to me and what I worship. I think that's what it's about. So I want to draw your attention, though, to verse 17. There's an interesting thing that happens in the language here. So in the New Living Translation that I read, verse 17 says, "If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, O Majesty." The word "if" we don't get what happens here. It's actually a threat to Nebuchadnezzar. A more literal reading of that phrase would be, if our God exists whom we are serving, he is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and from your hands, O king, he can deliver us. Which sounds initially like they're uncertain about his existence. You know, if our God exists, he can save us. But that would be incredible because they're putting their life on the line. Would you say, I'm going to be tossed into a fiery furnace and killed, and if my God exists, he'll save me? We wouldn't do that. We wouldn't put our life on the line for something we're uncertain about. It's actually a response to Nebuchadnezzar, because in verse 15, Nebuchadnezzar has threatened them twice with the word "if." And again, a more literal translation of 15 would be Nebuchadnezzar saying, if you are indeed ready to fall down before the statue I have made, and then if you do not bow down, you'll be thrown into the furnace. And so they respond with, if our God exists, whom we are serving, he's able to deliver us. They're not questioning his existence. It's a throwdown. It's bring it on. You are threatening us with your ifs. We are sure our God can save us. Are you prepared if our God saves us? It's a drop it all. Let's fight. And we don't catch that in the English. And you might ask, because I was thinking about this yesterday, is this how we're supposed to relate to someone who's challenging our worship? Just bring it on. Like, is that what we're supposed to do? Because it's very passionate. But remember, they're fighting for their life. Like, their life is at stake right in this moment, which ups the ante quite a bit. They're making a wager on this fight, and the buy-in for the wager is their life. So we like stories like this because God wins. But they did not know what God would do. They didn't know God's plan. So the center of their response is in verse 17, where they say, God will rescue us from your power, O Majesty, but even if he does not, we want to make it clear to you, O Majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you've set up. Even if he doesn't, God can, but even if he doesn't, we will not. Nebuchadnezzar's lost. Like, he lost whether God saves these guys or not. Nebuchadnezzar lost. Their commitment to God, their confidence in God's ability and his worthiness and his goodness, it totally trumps the threat from Nebuchadnezzar. So one commentator, Walter Luthi, said that there are three men who do not worship in Nebuchadnezzar's totalitarian state is a miracle of God. That the three were not devoured by the fire is no greater miracle. Suppose the fiery furnace had consumed them. The real miracle would still have happened. They didn't bow down. Nebuchadnezzar lost. They wouldn't worship. How would you have done in this story? For real. I think at times our response would be, if God exists, I'm sure he will save us. And if we're not saved, then maybe my God doesn't exist. I mean, honestly, sometimes that's how we think. But that test is not a test for God, that's a test for us. Does God have to bless us in order for us to side with him? And that's not the story. And that's not what belief is about. If God exists, I'm sure he will save us. There's another response that says, if God saves me first, then I will believe he can save me. That one, if God saves me first, then I believe he can save me, is if God makes the test go away, then I will believe in him. But remember, these guys didn't do anything wrong. Like, they didn't get themselves into this situation. They're not, to ask what is happening, what did I do wrong to cause this? That's not the story. They didn't bring the test on themselves. The test was set up for them. And God did not save them from the fire. God saved them in the fire. And we would often say, God, take the test away. And in this passage, he doesn't. He saves them in the test. So we know there are lots of stories where God doesn't respond like this. So it wasn't about the faithfulness of these particular guys that caused God to save them. It wasn't like in the morning they chose not to eat pork and they avoided the bacon and God was really happy with them and so therefore God saved their life. Like, they didn't do anything to cause this story and they didn't do anything to make God or force God to save them. So we know that God does not always save us. There's a bigger story going on. So let's look at the bigger story, and that's actually Nebuchadnezzar's story. Now remember last week, this part of Daniel from chapter 2 to chapter 8 is all in Aramaic. That's the language of the empire of Babylon. That's different than Hebrew, which is the language for the folks in Judah. And the first chapter and the last chapters are in Hebrew, but Daniel does this weird thing where this middle piece is all in Aramaic because it's for the people of Babylon. This part of the story is for Nebuchadnezzar. It's for the empire. It's for the public. So what does this story say to the public? What does the story say to Nebuchadnezzar? So let's remember, Nebuchadnezzar's ego is all tied into the statue. There is, I don't know if you caught it, there is a frequent use of the word set up in the story. Nebuchadnezzar made a huge gold statue and set it up on the plains of Duran. He called all the people to come to the dedication of the statue he had set up. So all the officials came and stood before the statue King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. He said, "When you hear the instruments bow before the statue Nebuchadnezzar has set up." At the sound they did bow at the statue he had set up. But the accusers pointed out, "These three guys refuse to bow at the statue you have set up." The king questions them, "You refuse to serve my God or worship the gold statue I have set up?" And they respond, "Even if God does not save us, we will not respond to the gold statue you have set up." This story cannot mention the gold statue without reminding us who set it up. It's like through the whole passage, Nebuchadnezzar saying, "I did that, I did that, that statue, I did that, I did that, I did that, I did that." It gets so tied up. And then there is this tone of spectacle and pretension in the text. He never says, or rarely says, instruments or the band, but he has to list it out. When all the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipes, and other musical instruments, he could have just said the band. And in the NLT, the New Living Translation, sometimes it simplifies it and says the instruments. In the actual language, all those instruments are listed out every single time. And then when he calls folks to worship, he doesn't just say the head of Babylon or the head of my government. He lists out everybody's job description, the high officers, the officials, the governors, the advisors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the provincial officials. And then he talks to all the races and all the languages and all the people. It's like whenever Nebuchadnezzar does something in this story, he has to lay out all the details for you to see it. Look at all the details of my greatness. Are you noticing? Like this worship is so tied into his ego. And then when these three guys don't serve his God and don't worship the gold statue, he flies into this furious rage. And he wants to throw them into a raging fire. And I think in the story, the reason why the fire is so hot is because they're trying to connect it to his anger. It's like, I'm throwing you into my anger. I'm throwing you into this furnace. And this key line, what God will rescue you from my power. You ever fallen into a fiery rage? Just think about it. Have you ever burst out in fiery rage? Or you're mad at somebody and something within you says something with the tone that says, who will rescue you from my power, right? You come do the dishes or you will never, you pick up the laundry in your room or you will never know the end of my wrath. I think I've mentioned this before, the idea of stepping on a false god, stepping on somebody's false god. We all have things that we value highly. And when someone offends something we value highly, we flare up in anger very quickly. They step on our God. So if you value your job very highly and someone diminishes the importance of your work, you'll flare into anger because that job is your false god. Or if a stranger insults you or even sort of insults you and you value yourself above all things, you'll flare into anger because you are the god. If you value being the guy who can fix things, I'm the guy who knows how to work things out, and then you can't figure something out, you'll flare up into anger because it's stepping on your God. If your intelligence is your God and someone makes you feel stupid, you'll flare up in anger. Or maybe it's a relationship that is your God, and the other person does something that suggests perhaps they don't feel the same way about you. and you'll flare up in anger. They're stepping on a false god. And we all have them. Our false gods give us a sense of identity and give us a sense of value. And when someone doesn't honor it or steps on it, you're offending my dignity. You're offending my value or my identity. If you catch yourself bursting into rage, if you can later on when you've calmed down, ask yourself, why did I get so mad about this? And look for something within yourself that was offended. Something that you worship that was offended. There's the false god, even if you are the false god. But calm down. Why did I get so angry when they said no to my request to pick up the laundry? Why did I get so angry when I felt like they snubbed me, on the street? It's not that you were offended. It's the why did I get so angry at this? Look for a false god there. Our identity, our value, how we understand ourselves has to increasingly be shaped and defined by God's love for us, his value in us. He's the one who gives us who we are. And as we learn that we have value because the Creator God gives us value and loves us, then we're able to let go of these things that are of lesser value. When you get upset and respond with something like, "What God will save you from my power," you'll know what Nebuchadnezzar felt like, and you find yourself in his shoes. And I think that's actually the larger message in the passage. What does this story say to Nebuchadnezzar? It says that the Lord God is the real God and not you. And that's the message Nebuchadnezzar has to figure out. And it's the same message we have to figure out. The Lord is God, not us. So in this story, we have two real passionate sides. One side is, I will not worship any God but the Lord. And the other side is, you will worship me and my false God. So the question is, which side are you going to be on? So let's discuss this passage together. Where's the Holy Spirit been drawing your attention? Let me recap. Nebuchadnezzar has set up this huge false god and demanded that everybody worship it. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refuse. They will not worship any god but the Lord their God. And Nebuchadnezzar has lost. Whether God rescues them from the fire or not, he's lost. How would you respond in that situation? Is your response more like, if God exists, he will rescue me? He must bless me in order for me to trust him? Or is your response, God needs to rescue me by removing me from the situation or getting the test to go away? God didn't save them from the fire, he saved them in the fire. But maybe the larger message is for Nebuchadnezzar. With all the puffing up he does about himself, that he sets up the statue and he has all the instruments play and he calls all the leaders by their titles and he refers to all the nations and races on earth. Come and worship what I did. Worship my God. And he bursts into a fiery rage when someone doesn't worship his God. We all have false gods. Can we identify them and let them go? So two very passionate sides. I will not worship any God but the Lord, or you will worship me and my false God. So how's the story been landing with you? Where's the Spirit been sort of drawing your attention or your thinking in this text?
Nebuchadnezzar is one of these guys who has too much money and can't think.
Nebuchadnezzar is one, I'm just going to repeat it. Nebuchadnezzar is one of these guys who has too much money and can't think.
No common sense.
No common sense. He's got all the money. Why do we need common sense?
He can do whatever he wants.
Yeah.
Common sense is not a factor in anything anymore.
Common sense is not a factor in anything anymore, yeah.
Yeah, so you've pointed this out before. This is the same Nebuchadnezzar who created the hanging gardens that are one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. And so in Daniel 1, where you talked about Daniel interpreting the dream, basically Daniel affirms that God in heaven has given you authority And the way Daniel worded it, or at least how it comes down to us, is over every living beast
Yep.
and over the whole world. And so in the dream, not only was the statue gold, Daniel's interpretation of that is that God has given you this incredible reign and that everything is subject to you. So he got a lot of messages that he was that great, and he was doing a lot of great things that actually, more than any one of us, have stood the test of time, like the gardens. But he was also very full of himself, like you just said. And so I do wonder what people were actually telling him about him is one thing. Like how he got to understand that was from the messaging he's been told. And also he was a bully. This guy was a
Just like
huge
that.
bully. And so when I think about Christine's, course that she wants to teach, I think about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and these guys living under a bully, in relationship with a bully, and having the healthiest boundaries. Like they knew where their boundaries were, and they had been tested when it came to eating, the king's food versus not. They had been threatened with death before when it came to interpreting the dream. They were going to kill all the wise men, including Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they were always living in relationship to him, on pins and needles, knowing that their life could just be chucked because he is a bully. He is like a total tyrant. And so these guys knew about healthy boundaries. They were aligned with the one true God. And regardless of the bully, that they had no power necessarily to change what their circumstances were in relationship to him, they knew who their God was, and they aligned their whole lives according to that. And so I think in life now, sometimes we can't change the fact about who our boss is or who is in our family and who might be fairly poor in some of their ways of expressing themselves to us. And I love that these guys just in a foreign land with this bully king a long time ago decided who their God was. And this is just context number 3 in a fairly frequent context of him exerting himself, that they've just, no, we're just going to be who we are, and we've already decided.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, really nice.
So what was kind of on my mind this morning was your question of, if I was in this situation, what would I have done? And my response to that is, well, it depends. So we have a very similar situation on Earth right now, and that is North Korea, where it is completely illegal to be a Christian. If you are a Christian and you are caught, you are executed along with your family, and then your extended family is sent to prison camp. So if I was in North Korea, or I knew somebody in North Korea, what would I recommend they do? It's what they do right now, where they become an underground Christian and they continue the work of Christians within the community. But it depends. Are they called to do something that stands up against the authority publicly and shames the authority, or are they called to do something that is more secretive, that extends the community and the faith and does specific goals? So it depends.
Yeah, I like that. And it depends who does my choices put at risk, and are we all willing for that? And yeah, but I like that. I like that, having to think it through.
So a couple things kind of came to my attention. I think 3 of them, and I'll start with the less important and move to perhaps the more important. The first one is, was the fire really real? Or was this just, God didn't actually do that. But the strongest men of Nebuchadnezzar's army died as a result of needing to get so close to it to throw the guys who were tied up in. These guys couldn't walk on their own. They had to be lifted. The strongest guys in the army get close enough to throw them in. Obviously, there's a door on it, and they die. This is a real fire. This is historical fact. We're not just talking about some kind of analogy. So that's kind of the first observation, that this is real. The second observation is, so Nebuchadnezzar has the dream in Daniel 2. he finds out, oh, I am the gold head. But there's this little tiny piece of diamond or whatever that comes and smashes the whole thing, enters into history. Now he has this reminder in Daniel 3 that there's a God out there who's more powerful than he is. And yet his response is, praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted in him. They defied the king's command and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make this decree: if any people, whatever their race or nation or language, speak a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they will be torn limb from limb, and their houses will be turned into heaps of rubble. There is no other God who can rescue like this. But he's still retaining the power that I'm going to do this to you if you... And
Interesting.
this isn't his God now. This is their God still. So
Interesting.
he acknowledges what his eyes cannot deny, but his heart doesn't submit.
Interesting.
And so so God's given him another chance. And
I love
as
that he can't just say, I'll punish them. Like, it's got to be, and I'll rip their arms out. Rather than, dude, just. Sorry, I cut you off.
Yeah, exactly, right?
You're overreacting.
So,
Sorry.
and the third thing is that for the Jews, so this is part of the Hebrew Bible,
Yeah.
this story, the Jews have been taken out of Jerusalem. The temple has been destroyed, completely destroyed. There's no more sacrifices. They have been removed from their land. Even the remnant that was there refused to trust God. They went out to Egypt, and then they got destroyed. And there's this tiny, so now you have the people of God, Abraham's descendants, who don't have a land, who don't have a temple, who maybe don't even have their scriptures. And yet, God is still in relationship with them. God is still present in power, just like the plagues in Egypt. He's still showing his power to his people. So the things that the people of Israel thought were needed to have a relationship with God, there's something else going on. There's a bigger story going on here. And it's part of the preparation for the Messiah to come. And so for us, are there things in our relationship with God that we think this has to be there? This is required. And I think this is a reminder to the Jews, and it's a reminder to us that God is, and he will have a relationship with his people. And these things that we think are absolutely necessary maybe are not as important. God across geography, God across history, can have a relationship with his people. He's the one who initiates. That was kind of the third thing that came to my mind.
That's great. You know what? There's an interesting potential other layer to this story. There's one manuscript. So we have, in scriptures, we have multiple copies of manuscripts, which is how we gather the original text. There's one version that's a Greek version that said in Nebuchadnezzar's 12th year this happened, which would be 586, which would be the year he destroyed, like the year he finally destroyed all of Jerusalem. If that is true, it would paint a picture of he destroyed the temple, took the last of the exiles, and then used perhaps the gold from that temple, which would be such a statement to the Jews that Nebuchadnezzar has completely destroyed the last remnants of your God. And then a story like this would be, no, I'm still here, doing something that completely, but I don't know, like we don't know the truthfulness of that, or if someone added that piece because it does exactly what I said. We just don't know.
That would be close timing, though.
Yeah, it would be very interesting, because they'd be like, our God is gone. No, still here. I'm going to do this. You've never conceived of this before. Save you from the fire. Yeah, cool.
Right off when I was reading this, I read it before the service. There's this phrase in there, that hits, and it's Nebuchadnezzar going, "What God can rescue you?" And God steps in and says, "Hey, good question. Let me introduce myself." But what a good God that we serve, that would do two amazing things. He would reach out to Nebuchadnezzar with a miracle and say, "Hey, you know what? I am real. I'm not just made of wood. I'm not just fickle and crazy. I'm talking to you." And that God would also influence Nebuchadnezzar in the way that he treats his people, the earthly ruler of the nation of Israel. I kind of noted that, as Charles had said, that he starts to understand that he acknowledges God's powerful, he's mighty, but he doesn't really seek God or repent from what he's doing, and he certainly doesn't do anything about his ego, which got me thinking. Follow this trail with me.
Okay.
There are still areas in my life where I suddenly will get angry. And I was thinking about those as you were saying, and very much it's the same switch.
Yep.
It's what ego thing is going on in me? What am I so prideful about that I need to be upset about it?
Yep.
And I can definitely see the way that God works in my life. Like there were some things that I was, so proud about when I worked for IBM. I'm a programmer for IBM. That ability just doesn't exist anymore. It's gone. Along with the fibro and the MCS came brain fog that was so profound that the abilities to do that are just gone. And yet God brought new and amazing blessings into my life, and an ability to reach out to people literally across the world, where we now have connection with the church in Pakistan.
Yeah.
And what an amazing blessing. What a good God he is, that he doesn't, when we're prideful, if we will acknowledge our sin to him, if we will bend our will and say, "Not mine, but yours," what amazing blessings he brings into our life.
Yeah. Love it. Love it.
I think my question always here is, how did Daniel not get caught in this sweep? But I guess for me, it's interesting. There are 2 points in this story where we see human beings doing something that human beings do, that we all have a chance to do once or twice in our lives, and they do different things. So what Nebuchadnezzar does is he's like, "This is my worldview. This is how it goes." And when he's presented with some really opposing evidence that his worldview is not actually true and complete, he's like, "Oh, there actually is a God that could save human beings from my ultimate magisterial wrath." He's like, "Okay, we'll include this God in my worldview. I'm not going to rethink my worldview. I'll just include this God, and I'll make sure that we are friends, we're buddies, because I'll be his policeman, I'll be his guy that'll enforce for him. But I'm not actually going to change the way I look at life. I'll just expand, and I'll include this God too, because apparently he's a big deal." And it's fascinating because God is not done with Nebuchadnezzar. We're going to keep going, and God is going to be like,
on him.
he really spent quite a bit of time going, "Dude, you're really influential, which is great, which comes from me. It's a gift from me. It would be awesome if you would use that well." And so he engages with Nebuchadnezzar over time to try and get him to think about this. And the next one is going to be a real slapdown, because he doesn't do it here. He's like, he gets really great proof that God is big, and he's like, just reformulate the whatever, but he doesn't actually change anything. He just adds to his another paragraph to his thing. Whereas the guys, it's really, you think about what got them to the point where they were standing there. We look at that and we go, "Oh my gosh, they were so brave." If you think about it, these guys as young men were hauled from their houses, hauled across continents in probably a very not respectful way.
They may have had to walk.
Yeah, they probably, or drag or whatever, right? And so then they were forced to be in the service of the palace, We haven't really talked about this too much, but like they may have had their lives entirely altered by being forced to become eunuchs. They were never going home. They were not going to be the heads of the family that they were raised to be. They were going to stay in this place and be basically high-end slaves forever. Yeah, they were administrative guys. They had government jobs, but they didn't have a choice. This wasn't like they applied for these jobs, even though it says he promoted them. Great, I mean, he told them where else to go, which was maybe a bigger, more responsible place. But it's not like they had a choice to say no. But they have been involved in this for quite a while. It's an intensive, terrible situation. And I'm sure that they have time to talk about it with each other and with anybody else who got, abducted and enslaved. They've already talked about this. And it sounds like they've come to the understanding that God is still with us. They must have gotten to that point to say, yeah, if you look back at our history, we really let him down. He really was with us and we didn't stick with him. We didn't do it. And so he told us, if you guys don't stick with this, things are going to come apart because I'm going to need to really get your attention. And that is what happened, which is why we're standing here in this weird capital city that we don't even recognize. And because we happen to be the generation that was alive when everything fell apart. And so they have figured this out. So by the time the guy's like, look, new statue, time to change your practices and have this musical worship session every however many times a day, they were like, I'm sure they talked about it. They're like, can we do this? We could. What? I'm sure they talked about it. And they're like, no, because by the time they got in front of him, they were pretty united. It doesn't say one of them was, well, okay, I'll bow. These three guys at least were like, can't be done, because they had a bigger picture of history. They had a bigger picture of what's going on. It's like somebody saying, I have this terrible job and my boss is ruining my life. So I have no choices. I have no chances. My life is wrecked. I'm grouchy at home. I don't have any future. I have no prospects. So basically, because of all this, my life is direct and it's not my fault. These guys, they trump you. If that you think that you have an excuse to have no control of your life, these guys really trump you. They have no control over things that people have control over if they're not slaves. But they are still saying, yes, but that's part of a bigger picture, which is that we are actually servants of God even before we are also slaves. We are, and we're doing the very best work we can do, which is why he promoted them, because they're doing good work, them and Daniel. But God is part of this, and he is with us. He can save us. In fact, we'll say to the king, you know what? If he wants to save us, he totally can save us from this ridiculous situation that you've put us in. But the fact that they said, but if he does not, he's still God. That doesn't cross out any of it. He is still God, and we are still not going to do this thing. And so, they really did kick him in the shins, and he had to respond by being all angry. But the fact that they were able to see their situation, things that they could not change, and they were able to say, but that's part of a bigger picture, and God is still with us. He is our God, we are his people, and we're going to act with integrity as we understand it in relationship with him, no matter what it actually costs us, because that's the important part. That's a huge deal. That's huge. That's really encouraging to a human heart to say, this is possible. We are not crushed by our situation if we are willing to let God help us have a big picture view of what's going on in the big picture. I think it's important.
I like that. Let me offer a prayer then, and we'll wind up. Father, what an amazing story. My mind is drawn to that line in Ecclesiastes that says, you have put eternity in our hearts, and that even though you've put eternity in our hearts and that you are sovereign, we have trouble understanding the start to the end. And yet you were at the start and you will be at the end. But we just get so lost in the moment and we miss how big a story you are writing. Lord, let me praise you and thank you for the goodness that you show us in this story, that you are faithful, and that at times you call us to give those statements of allegiance to you. And really, Lord, you lead us to understand and to declare and to live out that you are the one true God. You are the Lord. That's pretty cool. Father, when when we hit our own false gods and we fly into a rage and we're ready to bring down our wrath on someone because we feel offended, Lord, help us to see and understand what the gods are, what it is that we value above all things, what it is that causes us to fly into a rage, so that we can submit that to you, so that we can let it go, and we can acknowledge that you are the one who is God and not us. Yeah. Lord, continue to shape us as your disciples and lead us to be people who represent you and speak of you and whose lives are circled and danced around you as we live. Father, is there anything else? I would ask that you would help us to see your glory, help us to see your majesty and your amazingness. We praise you and we thank you for being our God. Amen.
Thank you for listening to our podcast today. New Life Ministries is located in Winnipeg, Manitoba. You are invited to join our service in person or over Zoom. Please use the Contact Us link to send an email to the church office and request the address or Zoom link. If you would like to use these podcasts as part of your home church or local church gathering, you are free to do so. We do request that you let us know. If there is any other way that we can help you in your ministry, please send us an email.